The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the gardens with their usual quiet efficiency. The scene below appeared peaceful, almost serene, but the weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on her shoulders. The entire nation was grieving, and as senior members of the royal family, she and William carried the responsibility of guiding the country through one of its darkest hours. 3 weeks had passed since the tragic incident that shook Britain to its core. A devastating fire at a children's hospital in Manchester had claimed the lives of 12 young patients, their families, and several heroic staff members who had refused to abandon their posts. The images that flooded the news channels were heartbreaking beyond measure. Parents clutching photographs of their lost children, firefighters emerging from the smoke-filled building with tears streaming down their soot-covered faces, and medical professionals who had worked tirelessly to save lives, only to lose their own in the process. The nation had united in grief, but it was a heavy, suffocating kind of unity. Flowers piled high outside the hospital gates, creating a sea of color that stretched for blocks. Thousands of people traveled from across the country to pay their respects, leaving teddy bears, handwritten notes, and candles that flickered through the night like tiny beacons of hope in an ocean of despair. Catherine turned away from the window and walked to her dressing table, where several briefing documents lay waiting for her review. The royal household had been inundated with requests for appearances, statements, and gestures of support. Every detail had to be carefully considered, every word weighed for its impact on a grieving nation. The pressure was immense, but Catherine had learned over the years that with great privilege came even greater responsibility. William entered the room quietly, his face bearing the same expression of solemn determination that had become his constant companion since the tragedy. He had spent the morning in meetings with government officials, hospital administrators, and grief counselors, trying to understand how the royal family could best serve the people during this difficult time. The conversations had been challenging, filled with raw emotion and desperate pleas for comfort that seemed impossible to provide. The Prime Minister called again, William said, settling into the chair beside Catherine's dressing table. The public response has been overwhelming. They're looking for leadership, for something to help them process this grief. He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that revealed his own struggle with the magnitude of the situation. Sometimes I wonder if anything we do can truly make a difference when people are hurting this deeply. Catherine reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become second nature over their years of marriage. We may not be able to take away their pain, she said softly, but we can show them they're not alone in it. Sometimes that's enough. Her voice carried the quiet strength that had made her such a beloved figure among the British people, a strength born not from privilege, but from genuine empathy and understanding. The couple had spent considerable time discussing how to respond appropriately to the tragedy. Traditional royal protocol called for formal statements, ceremonial appearances, and carefully orchestrated visits that maintained the proper distance between the monarchy and the people. But this situation felt different. The pain was too raw, too personal for formal gestures alone. The families who had lost children, the survivors who bore physical and emotional scars, and the entire community that had been shattered by the event needed something more meaningful than protocol could provide. Catherine picked up a letter from the pile on her dressing table, one of hundreds that had arrived from across the country. This particular envelope was addressed in a child's handwriting, the letters uneven and carefully formed. Inside, she found a drawing of a rainbow with the words for the sad families written in crayon at the bottom. The simplicity of the gesture, the pure intention behind it, moved her more than any formal condolence could have. "Look at this," she said, showing William the drawing. "This is what people need right now. Not grand gestures or speeches, but simple, genuine expressions of love and support." The drawing seemed to crystallize something that had been forming in her mind since the tragedy occurred. The royal family's response needed to come from the heart, not from a handbook of protocol. William studied the drawing, his expression softening as he took in the child's message. "You're thinking of something specific, aren't you?" He had learned to recognize the look in his wife's eyes when an idea was taking shape, a combination of determination and compassion that usually led to their most meaningful public engagements. Catherine nodded slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. What if we did something unexpected? Something that shows we're not just fulfilling royal duties, but actually sharing in the nation's grief? She stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the gardens where she and William often played with their own children. The thought of losing George, Charlotte, or Louis was unimaginable, yet 12 families in Manchester were living that nightmare every day. The idea that was forming in Catherine's mind was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of the expected formal visit to lay wreaths and offer condolences, what if they spent real time with the affected families? Not a brief, carefully scheduled encounter, but genuine, unhurried moments where they could listen, share tears, and offer the kind of comfort that could only come from human connection rather than royal obligation. William was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what his wife was suggesting. Breaking from traditional royal protocol always carried risks, but the potential impact of such a gesture could be profound. The palace staff will have concerns about security, about precedent, about controlling the narrative, he said, though his tone suggested he was already warming to the idea. Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that can't be controlled or scripted, Catherine replied. These families have lost everything. The least we can do is give them our genuine presence, not just our official sympathy. Her words carried the weight of someone who had spent years observing the difference between perfunctory royal duties and moments of real human connection. The morning progressed with a series of phone calls and meetings as Catherine and William began to outline their unconventional plan. Their private secretary, Sarah, initially expressed reservations about departing so significantly from established protocol. Security concerns would need to be addressed, media coverage would have to be carefully managed, and the expectations of multiple government agencies would need to be balanced against the couple's desire for authentic engagement. But as they discussed the details, even the most protocol-minded staff members began to understand the power of what the prince and princess were proposing. In a time when public trust in institutions was fragile and people craved authentic leadership, this gesture could demonstrate that the royal family truly understood their role as servants of the people rather than distant figures offering ceremonial comfort. By afternoon, the basic framework of their plan was taking shape. Rather than a single formal visit, they would spend 3 full days in Manchester, staying in a modest hotel rather than grand accommodations, and dedicating their time entirely to the affected families and community. They would visit homes, attend small memorial services, and participate in the kind of everyday activities that would allow for genuine connection rather than ceremonial distance. The decision to break with tradition wasn't taken lightly. Both Catherine and William understood that their actions would be scrutinized by the media, analyzed by royal watchers, and potentially criticized by those who believe the monarchy should maintain its traditional reserve. But they also recognized that extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary responses, and the grief that had enveloped the nation demanded something more than ordinary royal protocol could provide. As evening approached, Catherine found herself in the nursery, watching her children play with their toys, their laughter filling the room with the kind of joy that the Manchester families might never experience again. The contrast was almost unbearable, and she felt the weight of her privilege more acutely than ever before. Her children were safe, surrounded by love and security, while other parents were planning funerals instead of birthday parties. William joined her in the nursery, and together they watched their children, each lost in their own thoughts about the fragility of life and the randomness of tragedy. "We have to do this," Catherine said quietly, her voice barely audible above the children's play. "Not because it's expected of us, but because it's right." The final preparations for their Manchester visit continued late into the evening. with staff members working to coordinate security, accommodation, and logistics for what would be one of the most unconventional royal engagements in recent memory. Every detail had to be considered, from the clothes they would wear to the way they would interact with grieving families. But the overarching goal remained simple: to offer genuine human comfort in a time of unimaginable pain. As Catherine prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the weight of the responsibility they were undertaking. The eyes of the nation would be upon them, looking for signs of hope, comfort, and leadership during one of the darkest periods in recent British history. The gesture they were planning could help heal a wounded nation, or it could fall short of the enormous expectations that had been placed upon it. But sometimes, Catherine thought as she turned off the lights, the most important actions were also the most uncertain. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something unprecedented, a royal response born not from duty or tradition, but from a simple human recognition that in times of great sorrow, people needed to know they were not alone. The success or failure of their gesture would ultimately be measured not in headlines or public opinion polls, but in the comfort it might bring to families whose worlds had been forever changed by an unthinkable tragedy. The journey to Manchester began in the early morning hours, with Catherine and William traveling in a modest convoy that deliberately avoided the usual pomp and ceremony associated with royal visits. Instead of the traditional motorcade, with its flags and fanfare, they chose unmarked vehicles and a minimal security presence that would allow them to move through the city without creating additional disruption for a community already overwhelmed by media attention and public scrutiny. As their car wound through the streets of Manchester, Catherine watched the landscape change from rolling countryside to urban neighborhoods, still bearing visible signs of the tragedy that had brought them there. Flowers lined the sidewalks leading to the hospital, and makeshift memorials had sprouted on nearly every corner. The city wore its grief openly, unashamed of the tears that seemed to flow constantly from residents who had been touched by the loss of so many young lives. Their first stop was not the hospital itself, which remained closed to all but essential personnel, but rather a community center that had been transformed into a gathering place for affected families. The building, usually home to children's programs and senior citizen activities, now served as a refuge for those struggling to navigate their new reality. Counselors moved quietly between small groups of people, offering tissues and gentle words, while volunteers prepared endless cups of tea and simple meals for those too overwhelmed by grief to care for themselves. When Catherine and William entered the community center, the atmosphere was subdued but not silent. Conversations continued in hushed tones. Children played quietly in corners under the watchful eyes of relatives and family friends, and the daily business of grieving carried on with the resilience that had always characterized the people of Manchester. The prince and princess had specifically requested that their arrival not be announced in advance, wanting to slip into the space as naturally as possible rather than creating a formal receiving line or ceremonial presentation. Mary Henderson, a local volunteer coordinator, was the first to recognize them. She had been organizing meal deliveries for affected families when she looked up to see the familiar faces she had only previously encountered on television screens and magazine covers. For a moment, she simply stared, uncertain whether her eyes were playing tricks on her in this surreal environment where normal life had been suspended for weeks. Catherine approached Mary with a warm smile that seemed to bridge the gap between royal protocol and human connection. "I'm Catherine," she said simply, extending her hand as if meeting a neighbor rather than conducting royal business. "William, and I wanted to come and spend some time with everyone here. We hope that's all right." The informal introduction set the tone for everything that would follow, establishing that this visit would be guided by compassion rather than ceremony. Mary's initial shock quickly gave way to appreciation for the couple's understated approach. "Of course," she replied, her voice catching slightly as the reality of their presence sank in. "Everyone here will be so grateful that you've come. We've all been feeling so alone with this." Her words captured the isolation that often accompanies profound grief, the sense that the rest of the world continues its normal pace while those left behind struggle to find their footing in a changed reality. William knelt beside a group of children who were working on a puzzle together, their young faces marked by a seriousness that spoke to the weight of what they had experienced. These were siblings and friends of the children who had died in the hospital fire, youngsters who had lost playmates, and were struggling to understand why their world had suddenly become so sad and frightening. "What are you working on?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the same warmth he used when speaking with his own children. 8-year-old James Thompson looked up with eyes that held far too much knowledge for his age. "It's a picture of a rainbow," he said quietly. "My sister Emma loved rainbows. She said they meant that sad times would get better." James's sister had been one of the youngest victims of the fire, a 5-year-old girl who had been receiving treatment for a chronic condition when the tragedy struck. His simple explanation of the puzzle carried the weight of a child trying to process loss beyond his comprehension. Catherine sat down beside James, studying the partially completed puzzle with genuine interest. "Emma sounds like she was a very smart little girl," she said softly. "Rainbows do appear after storms, don't they? Maybe she was trying to tell you that beautiful things can still happen, even when we're feeling sad." Her words were carefully chosen, offering comfort without diminishing the reality of the boy's grief or making false promises about pain that would likely last for years. As the morning progressed, Catherine and William moved naturally through the community center, sitting with families, listening to stories, and offering the kind of presence that couldn't be scheduled or scripted. They heard about children who had been passionate about football, little girls who loved to dance, and young boys who dreamed of becoming firefighters like the heroes who had tried to save them. Each story was unique, yet they all shared the common thread of lives cut short and dreams that would never be fulfilled. Patricia Collins, whose 6-year-old daughter had died in the fire, initially hesitated to speak with the royal couple. Her grief was still so raw that she found it difficult to engage with anyone, even well-meaning friends and family members. But something about Catherine's gentle approach, her willingness to simply sit quietly without demanding conversation, gradually drew Patricia into dialogue. "Sophie was going to start school in September," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had already picked out her backpack and lunchbox. "We spent hours practicing writing her name." The simple details of a child's anticipated future carried enormous weight, representing all the milestones and memories that would never come to pass. These were the losses that statistics couldn't capture, the human elements that transformed tragedy from abstract concept to devastating reality. Catherine listened without offering platitudes or easy comfort, understanding that sometimes grief needed to be witnessed rather than fixed. "Tell me more about Sophie," she said gently. "What made her laugh?" The question invited Patricia to remember her daughter not just as a victim of tragedy, but as a complete person with preferences, personality, and the kind of quirks that make each child unique. For the next hour, Patricia shared memories of her daughter's love for strawberry ice cream, her tendency to sing made-up songs while playing with her dolls, and her habit of insisting on wearing her favorite purple dress to every special occasion. As she talked, her posture gradually relaxed, and though tears continued to flow, they were accompanied by occasional smiles as she recalled moments of joy rather than focusing solely on the pain of loss. William spent considerable time with the fathers and male relatives of the victims, understanding that men often struggled differently with grief, sometimes feeling pressure to remain strong for others while dealing with their own overwhelming emotions. In a quiet corner of the community center, he found himself in conversation with David Murphy, whose 10-year-old son had been one of the fire victims. David had been struggling with guilt, convinced that he should have somehow prevented the tragedy or that his response in the aftermath had been inadequate. "I keep thinking there must have been something I could have done," he confided to William. "Maybe if I had insisted on staying with him, or if I had been more careful about which hospital we chose for his treatment." The self-blame that often accompanies sudden loss was evident in every word, the desperate search for some sense of control in a situation that had been entirely beyond anyone's influence. William recognized the familiar pattern of survivor's guilt, having encountered it in his work with veterans and emergency responders. The fire started in an electrical panel in a basement maintenance room, he said quietly. There is nothing you or anyone else could have done to predict or prevent it. Your son knew he was loved, and that's what matters. His words carried authority, not just because of his position, but because they came from someone who had spent years working with people traumatized by circumstances beyond their control. The conversation continued for over an hour, with David gradually beginning to separate his role as a loving father from the impossible expectation that he could have controlled forces beyond human prediction or intervention. It was a small step in what would undoubtedly be a long healing process, but it represented the kind of meaningful connection that the royal couple had hoped to achieve through their unconventional visit. As afternoon approached, Catherine and William participated in a simple memorial service that had been organized by the community itself. Rather than a formal ceremony with official readings and prescribed responses, this gathering emerged organically from the need of local residents to come together and honor their lost neighbors. The service was held in a small park adjacent to the community center, under trees that provided natural shelter for the couple hundred people who attended. Local clergy from various denominations shared the leadership of the service, but the most powerful moments came from community members themselves. Parents read poems their children had written. Teachers shared memories of students who would never return to their classrooms, and neighbors spoke about the ways the young victims had touched their lives through simple acts of kindness and friendship. Catherine and William participated not as official representatives of the crown, but as fellow mourners contributing to a collective expression of grief and love. When invited to plant a tree that would serve as a living memorial to the victims, they worked alongside family members to place the young sapling in soil that had been mixed with earth from the children's favorite places around the city. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Like the tree, the memory of the victims would continue to grow and provide comfort for future generations, while the mixing of soil from their favorite locations ensured that their spirits would remain connected to the places and people they had loved. It was exactly the kind of meaningful gesture that formal royal protocol could never have accommodated, yet felt more appropriate and healing than any traditional ceremony might have been. As evening settled over Manchester, Catherine and William made their way to the modest hotel where they would be staying for the duration of their visit. The choice to forego royal residences or luxury accommodations in favor of a simple business hotel in the heart of the city was intentional, demonstrating their commitment to experiencing the community as ordinary visitors rather than privileged guests requiring special treatment. Their day had been emotionally exhausting, filled with conversations that challenged their ability to provide comfort while processing their own responses to such overwhelming grief. Yet both felt that they had begun to achieve their goal of offering genuine human connection to people who desperately needed to know they were not forgotten or alone in their suffering. The evening news coverage of their visit was notably different from typical royal reporting. Instead of focusing on fashion choices or ceremonial protocols, journalists found themselves documenting spontaneous moments of human connection that couldn't be staged or scripted. The images that emerged from the day showed not distant royalty fulfilling obligations, but two people genuinely engaged with their fellow citizens during a time of shared sorrow. As Catherine and William prepared for sleep in their simple hotel room, they reflected on the day's experiences and planned for the 2 days still ahead of them. They had learned that grief was not a problem to be solved or a situation to be managed, but rather a human experience to be shared and witnessed with compassion and presence. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to demonstrate that lesson, as they continued their unconventional journey through a community learning to rebuild itself after unimaginable loss. The second day of their Manchester visit dawned gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent rain that seemed to mirror the city's collective mood. Catherine woke early in their modest hotel room, the sounds of the awakening city filtering through the thin walls. Unlike the isolation of royal residences, this accommodation placed them directly in the heart of the community they had come to support, allowing them to hear the ordinary sounds of people beginning another day while carrying extraordinary grief. After a simple breakfast in the hotel's small dining room, where they sat among business travelers and local residents rather than in private quarters, Catherine and William prepared for what would be perhaps the most challenging day of their visit. They had arranged to spend time in the homes of several affected families, accepting invitations to share meals and participate in the kind of intimate gatherings that royal protocol typically avoided. Their first visit was to the Thompson family home, where James, the 8-year-old boy they had met the previous day, lived with his parents and grandmother. The house was a modest terrace property in a working-class neighborhood, with a small front garden where Emma Thompson's bicycle still stood against the fence, decorated with flowers and small toys left by neighbors and school friends who continued to struggle with her absence. Margaret Thompson, James's mother, had spent the early morning hours cleaning and preparing for the royal visit with a nervous energy that reflected both anticipation and anxiety. She had never imagined that members of the royal family would sit in her living room, much less during the darkest period of her family's life. Yet when Catherine and William arrived at her door, their warm, understated presence immediately put her at ease. "Please, just come in as you are," Margaret said, opening the door wide. "We're not much for formality here." Her words carried the straightforward honesty that characterized many of the families they had encountered, people too overwhelmed by grief to worry about social protocols or royal etiquette. The simplicity of the invitation set the tone for what would prove to be a profoundly meaningful encounter. The Thompson living room was filled with photographs of Emma at various stages of her short life, from baby pictures to recent school photos that captured her bright smile and mischievous personality. Catherine studied these images with genuine interest, asking questions about Emma's interests and personality that went far beyond polite conversation. She learned that Emma had been passionate about animals, particularly horses, and had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. William found himself drawn to a corner of the room where Emma's art supplies were still arranged on a small table, exactly as she had left them the morning of the hospital fire. Drawings and paintings covered the wall nearby, depicting rainbows, flowers, and family portraits rendered with the enthusiastic imperfection that made children's art so endearing. Each piece told a story about a little girl's view of the world, full of color and optimism that contrasted sharply with the sadness that now permeated the house. James, who had been quiet since their arrival, gradually warmed to the couple's presence. He showed them Emma's favorite hiding spot behind the sofa, where she used to retreat with books and snacks when she wanted privacy. He demonstrated how she had taught herself to whistle, a skill she had been particularly proud of, and shared the secret language of gestures and expressions they had developed as siblings who were especially close despite their age difference. "Emma always said she was going to be my best friend forever," James confided to Catherine as they sat together on the floor, looking through a photo album. "She promised we would live next door to each other when we grew up and have lots of pets." The future plans that siblings create together represented another layer of loss, dreams that had been shared between the children and would now exist only in James's memory. Margaret Thompson served tea and biscuits with the kind of grace that comes from years of practice at making visitors feel welcome, but the effort required to maintain normalcy was evident in her careful movements and forced smiles. Catherine recognized the exhaustion that accompanied prolonged grief, the way simple tasks became monumental when every action required navigating around the absent presence of a lost loved one. "You don't have to entertain us," Catherine said gently, settling into the conversation as naturally as if she were visiting an old friend. "We're here because we wanted to know Emma through your eyes, not because we need anything from you." The assurance seemed to release some of the tension Margaret had been carrying, allowing her to speak more naturally about her daughter's life rather than focusing solely on the circumstances of her death. For the next 2 hours, the Thompson family shared stories that painted a complete picture of Emma's personality, her relationships with friends and family, her struggles with her chronic illness, and her determination to live as normally as possible despite frequent hospital visits. The conversation revealed a child who had faced medical challenges with remarkable resilience, who had comforted other young patients during treatment, and who had maintained an optimistic outlook that inspired everyone around her. William was particularly moved by Margaret's description of Emma's reaction to learning about her illness. Rather than becoming withdrawn or fearful, the little girl had decided that her experiences in the hospital made her specially qualified to help other sick children. She had spent her last months creating drawings and writing encouraging notes for other young patients, determined to use her situation to bring comfort to others facing similar challenges. The story revealed the kind of character that transcended age, a wisdom and compassion that some adults never develop. It also highlighted the particular tragedy of losing children who had already demonstrated extraordinary capacity for kindness and courage. Emma had not simply been a victim of circumstance, but a person who had actively chosen to respond to difficulty with generosity and hope. When it came time to leave the Thompson home, the goodbye was marked by genuine affection rather than formal courtesy. James hugged both Catherine and William, extracting promises that they would remember Emma and perhaps visit again someday. Margaret Thompson, who had initially worried about being an inadequate host for royal guests, found herself feeling grateful for the opportunity to share her daughter's story with people who had listened with genuine interest and compassion. Their next visit took them to a different part of the city, where the Rodriguez family had been struggling with the loss of their 12-year-old son, Carlos. The boy had been the family's translator, helping his Spanish-speaking grandparents navigate English-language situations and serving as a bridge between generations with different cultural backgrounds and linguistic abilities. His death had created practical challenges in addition to emotional devastation, leaving family members feeling isolated and unable to access services they needed. Catherine's ability to speak some Spanish, though limited, proved invaluable in connecting with Carlos's grandmother, Maria, who had been struggling to communicate her grief in a language that felt foreign to her emotions. The simple act of offering condolences in Spanish, however imperfect, demonstrated a level of respect and understanding that transcended linguistic barriers and touched the entire family. Carlos's father, Miguel, had been working multiple jobs to support his extended family and had been tormented by guilt over not being present at the hospital when the fire occurred. He had been delivering food for his catering business when the tragedy struck, and the randomness of timing had become a source of self-recrimination that threatened to consume him alongside his grief. William spent considerable time with Miguel, drawing on his military experience and his work with veteran organizations to address the complicated relationship between duty and guilt that often accompanies sudden loss. Being a good father means providing for your family, William said quietly as they stood in the small backyard where Carlos had maintained a vegetable garden. You were doing exactly what you should have been doing. Carlos knew he was loved and supported. That's what matters. The conversation continued as they examined the garden that Carlos had started the previous spring, with rows of tomatoes and peppers that were now being tended by his younger sister, Isabella. The 10-year-old girl had taken over her brother's project as a way of staying connected to him, carefully watering and weeding the plants with the same attention he had shown. The garden represented continuity and hope, a tangible connection to Carlos's interests and dreams that could be maintained and nurtured even after his death. Isabella showed Catherine the notebook where Carlos had recorded his gardening observations, complete with drawings of different growth stages and notes about which vegetables seemed to thrive in their small plot. The careful documentation revealed a scientific mind and a patient temperament, qualities that had made him an excellent student and a natural leader among his peers. Carlos wanted to study agriculture in university. Isabella explained, her English carefully pronounced as her brother had taught her. He said he wanted to help people grow better food, so no one would be hungry. The ambitious yet altruistic goal reflected the kind of thinking that emerges when young people are raised with awareness of both opportunity and responsibility, understanding that education should serve purposes beyond individual advancement. The Rodriguez family's experience illustrated the ripple effects of tragedy on communities with limited resources and complex family structures. Carlos's role as translator and cultural mediator had been crucial to his family's ability to navigate various systems, from healthcare to education to employment. His loss created practical challenges that compounded the emotional devastation, requiring the family to develop new strategies for accessing services while simultaneously processing their grief. Catherine and William spent the afternoon helping Isabella with her garden, learning about the plants Carlos had chosen and understanding his vision for expanding the project. They also participated in preparing a traditional meal that honored Carlos's memory, with family members teaching them to make his favorite dishes while sharing stories about his personality and interests. The evening concluded with a visit to the local community college where Carlos had been taking weekend classes in sustainable agriculture, despite his young age. His instructor, Professor Martinez, had arranged for several students to share their memories of their youngest classmate, painting a picture of a boy who had approached learning with enthusiasm and maturity that impressed both peers and teachers. Carlos asked questions that challenged all of us to think more deeply. Professor Martinez explained to Catherine and William as they toured the small greenhouse where Carlos had conducted his first experiments with sustainable growing methods. He wasn't just learning for himself, but thinking about how knowledge could be applied to help his community and others facing food insecurity. The professor's description revealed another dimension of Carlos's character, his ability to connect academic learning with practical applications that could benefit others. This mature perspective on education reflected the kind of thinking that often emerges in young people who have observed economic struggle firsthand and understand the importance of using opportunity to create positive change. As Catherine and William returned to their hotel that evening, they carried with them a deeper understanding of how tragedy affects different families in unique ways, depending on their circumstances, resources, and cultural backgrounds. They had witnessed the universal nature of parental love, while also observing how grief intersects with practical challenges that extend far beyond emotional processing. The day had reinforced their conviction that meaningful support required understanding each family's specific situation rather than applying generic approaches to comfort and assistance. Tomorrow would bring their final day in Manchester, with opportunities to engage with the broader community and explore ways to ensure that the connections they had made would continue beyond their visit. Their unconventional approach to royal duty was proving effective in ways that traditional protocol never could have achieved. By stepping outside established boundaries and engaging authentically with grief-stricken families, they had demonstrated a model of leadership based on genuine human connection rather than ceremonial distance. The challenge now would be translating these personal relationships into lasting support that could help the community rebuild and heal over the months and years ahead. The final day of Catherine and William's Manchester visit began with an unexpected development that would transform their planned activities and create one of the most memorable moments of their unconventional journey. As they prepared to leave their hotel for a morning visit to the temporary memorial site, they received word that several families had organized a spontaneous gathering in a nearby park where the memorial service had been held 2 days earlier. The gathering had emerged organically from conversations between families who had been touched by the royal couple's genuine presence and wanted to express their gratitude in a collective way. Word had spread through social media and neighborhood networks, drawing not only affected families, but also community members who had been inspired by the unprecedented nature of the royal visit. What began as a small thank you gathering had grown into something much larger and more significant. When Catherine and William arrived at the park, they found nearly 1,000 people assembled in an atmosphere that somehow managed to combine grief, gratitude, and hope in equal measure. Children played quietly under the watchful eyes of adults who had learned to appreciate every moment of innocent joy, while teenagers who had lost friends stood in small groups, supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of processing loss at such a formative age. The crowd had arranged itself naturally around the memorial tree that had been planted during the formal service, with families closest to the center and community supporters forming widening circles that extended throughout the available space. Handmade signs and banners dotted the gathering, bearing messages of thanks and expressions of love that reflected the community's appreciation for the royal couple's unconventional approach to their visit. Sarah Mitchell, a local teacher whose classroom had lost 3 students in the hospital fire, had emerged as an unofficial spokesperson for the gathering. She approached Catherine and William with the confidence that comes from years of managing large groups of children, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had been fundamentally changed by recent events. "We wanted to tell you what your visit has meant to us," she said, her words carrying the collective sentiment of the assembled crowd. "You've shown us that we're not alone in this." The teacher's simple statement captured something essential about the impact of the royal couple's presence in Manchester. By choosing authentic engagement over ceremonial distance, they had demonstrated that grief was not something to be endured in isolation, but rather a human experience that could be shared and witnessed by people at every level of society. Their willingness to step outside traditional royal protocol had created space for genuine connection that transcended social boundaries and institutional expectations. Catherine found herself surrounded by children who had known the young victims, youngsters who had been struggling to understand why their friends were no longer present at school, in playgrounds, and in neighborhood gathering places. These survivors carried their own form of trauma, the confusion and fear that accompanies early exposure to mortality, and the randomness of tragic events. 10-year-old Amy Watson, who had been Emma Thompson's best friend, had been particularly affected by the loss. She approached Catherine with a carefully prepared speech that she had written and practiced, but her formal words quickly gave way to more natural conversation about her friendship with Emma and the difficulty of starting a new school year without her closest companion. "Emma was supposed to be in my class this year," Amy confided, her voice small but steady. "We had planned to sit together and help each other with difficult subjects. Now I have to do everything by myself." The practical aspects of childhood friendship, the way young people rely on each other for support and companionship, represented another dimension of loss that often went unrecognized in adult discussions of the tragedy. Catherine knelt to Amy's eye level, understanding the importance of meeting children where they were both physically and emotionally. "Emma would want you to make new friends and do well in school," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to forget her or stop missing her. You can carry her memory with you while also making room for new experiences." The advice balanced acknowledgement of loss with encouragement for continued growth, recognizing that healing often involves learning to hold multiple emotions simultaneously. William found himself in conversation with a group of teenagers who had been grappling with survivor guilt and questioning the fairness of a world where good people suffered while others remained unharmed. These young people were old enough to understand the philosophical implications of random tragedy, but not yet equipped with a life experience that might help them process such profound questions about justice and meaning. 16-year-old Marcus Johnson, whose younger brother had died in the fire, had been struggling with anger and confusion about continuing his own life plans when his family had been devastated. "It doesn't feel right to think about university or careers when everything has changed so much," he admitted to William. "How do you move forward when moving forward feels like leaving someone behind?" The question reflected a common challenge in grief recovery, the feeling that resuming normal activities somehow dishonors the memory of those who have died. William drew on his own experiences with loss, including the death of his mother, to offer perspective on the complex relationship between honoring the past and embracing the future. "The people we love want us to live fully, not to stop our lives because they can't continue theirs," William said thoughtfully. "Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting or leaving them behind. It means carrying their love with you as you create the kind of life they would want for you." His words reflected hard-won wisdom about the difference between healthy remembrance and paralyzing guilt. As the mourning progressed, The gathering evolved into an impromptu celebration of the lives that had been lost, with family members sharing stories and memories that painted complete pictures of their loved ones rather than focusing solely on the circumstances of their deaths. Parents talked about their children's dreams and aspirations, their favorite foods and activities, their quirky habits and endearing personality traits. The storytelling created a sense of community that extended beyond the immediate tragedy, connecting people through shared appreciation for the unique individuals they had lost. Children who had died became real people rather than abstract victims, with complex personalities and rich inner lives that deserve to be remembered and honored. Catherine and William participated in these exchanges not as formal representatives of the monarchy, but as fellow human beings who understood the importance of bearing witness to love and loss. They laughed at funny stories about childhood mischief, teared up during descriptions of tender moments between parents and children, and asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest in learning about each unique personality. The afternoon brought an unexpected opportunity when several local musicians, some of whom had been friends or family members of the victims, offered to perform songs that had been meaningful to their lost loved ones. The impromptu concert took place under cloudy skies that threatened rain, but the weather seemed irrelevant to people who had learned to find beauty and meaning in the midst of sorrow. Sarah Collins, Patricia's sister, sang a lullaby that she used to perform for her niece Sophie, her voice breaking occasionally, but continuing with determination to complete the tribute. The song became a shared experience of grief and love, with audience members humming along or simply listening in respectful silence that honored both the performance and the memory it represented. Local teenager Jake Morrison played guitar and sang a song he had written about his friendship with Carlos Rodriguez, celebrating their shared love of music and their dreams of starting a band together. The lyrics captured the specific details that make individual relationships irreplaceable, the inside jokes and shared experiences that create bonds between friends. As evening approached, the gathering began to take on the characteristics of a wake or celebration of life, with people sharing food and continuing conversations that had begun earlier in the day. The informal nature of the event allowed for the kind of organic development that serves grief better than structured ceremonies, creating space for laughter, tears, and everything in between. Catherine and William had originally planned to conclude their visit with a formal farewell ceremony, but the spontaneous gathering had created something far more meaningful. Instead of delivering prepared remarks from a designated podium, they found themselves moving through the crowd, offering individual thanks and farewells that acknowledged the personal connections they had developed over their 3 days in Manchester. The departure process took nearly 2 hours, as each family wanted to express their gratitude personally and ensure that the royal couple understood the impact of their unconventional visit. Children presented handmade gifts and drawings, parents shared final stories they wanted to ensure were heard, and community leaders offered thanks for the precedent that had been set through authentic engagement rather than ceremonial obligation. As their car finally pulled away from the park, Catherine and William could see the crowd slowly dispersing, but many people remained behind to continue conversations and maintain the connections that had been strengthened through shared experience. The gathering had demonstrated the community's resilience and capacity for mutual support, qualities that would be essential for long-term healing and recovery. The drive back to London provided time for reflection on the unprecedented nature of their Manchester experience and its potential implications for future royal engagements. They had demonstrated that meaningful public service could emerge from breaking with tradition when circumstances demanded authentic human response rather than ceremonial protocol. News coverage of their visit focused not on fashion choices or royal protocols, but on the genuine connections they had formed with grieving families and the model they had established for leadership based on empathy rather than distance. Editorial commentary praised their willingness to take risks in service of providing real comfort to citizens facing unimaginable loss. In the weeks that followed their return to London, Catherine and William maintained contact with many of the families they had met, sending personal notes on difficult anniversaries and following up on commitments they had made to support ongoing community healing initiatives. Their visit had established relationships that continued beyond the immediate crisis, demonstrating sustained commitment to the people they had encountered. The Manchester visit became a turning point in public perception of the royal family's role during times of national crisis, establishing expectations for authentic engagement that would influence how future tragedies were addressed. Catherine and William had shown that the monarchy's greatest power lay not in ceremonial grandeur, but in the ability to provide genuine human connection during moments when people most needed to feel understood and supported. The gentle gesture that had begun as a response to overwhelming grief had evolved into a demonstration of leadership that transcended traditional boundaries between royalty and citizens. By choosing authenticity over protocol, Catherine and William had helped the mourning nation begin to heal while establishing a new model for public service based on empathy, presence, and genuine human connection. Their time in Manchester had proven that sometimes the most powerful actions were also the simplest, showing up, listening carefully, and demonstrating through presence rather than words that no one had to carry their grief alone. In a world often characterized by distance and formality, they had offered the radical gift of authentic human connection, and in doing so had touched not only the lives of those directly affected by tragedy, but the heart of a nation learning to rebuild itself through love, support, and shared commitment to honoring the memory of lives lost too soon.